Good evening, and welcome to this special edition of the Christian Recorder Dialogues in partnership with the Star of Zion. We are excited to share with you. We're not quite back from our hiatus for the General Conference, but we had a special dialogue planned for you in this season. So today we have a panel on the groundbreaking book, White Too Long. We are delighted to have this discussion with some esteemed panelists who are joining us this evening. We have with us the author of the book, Dr. Robert Jones, who is from who is the CEO of the PRRI, which is a landmark think tank regarding religion. This book, White Too Long, came out in 2019 and won the Grawemeyer Award of Religion. And Dr. Jones writes regularly on politics, culture, religion for several outlets. You can also visit his website, prrri.org. You will see his research out in many venues. We've had with us to guide our discussion. We have Dr. Joel Hunter, who served the senior pastor of Northland Church in Longwood, Florida for 32 years, and he is currently the president of the Parable Foundation. Dr. Hunter is a renowned pastor and evangelist in Florida and was voted as one of Orlando's 50 most powerful persons several times. And we have with us from the AME Church, Reverend Terence Gray, the pastor of St. Mark AME Church, Orlando, who is also a candidate for Congress in the 10th Congressional District of Florida. The genesis for this discussion came from a panel that Reverend Gray, Dr. Hunter, and Dr. Jones did last year on the book White Too Long. You're probably wondering, why is a Black church having a panel on a book White Too Long? We know what racism means, right? Well, the thing is, this book is groundbreaking because Dr. Jones does an insightful and trenchant analysis of how race has impacted American Christianity. And it's one thing to live through racism, it's one thing to experience it, but this book gives a discussion and points and opens eyes in places that we may have lived but not seen. So we wanted to have this discussion, to have this provoking dialogue, because racism is a problem that affects all Americans in all ways of life, even in our religion. And of course, we are doing this in partnership with the Star of Zion of the AME Zion Church. At the time, the then editor, Addie Lisby, who was a family friend of Reverend Gray, said, we should come together as sister churches to do this dialogue. And I'm thankful that my colleague, the new editor of the Star of Zion, Brother Kent, I almost made you Dr. Kent, but that's coming, agreed to do this dialogue. So we are excited to be in a partnership with our Pan Methodist sister church, the AME Zion Church. We're excited for this dialogue, and we will tell you again that the book White Too Long, we will talk more about it at the end of the discussion, but through a special partnership with Cokesbury. You could go to Cokesbury to purchase White Too Long at a discount. That's right. The White Too Long discount is available through Cokesbury up until September the 30th. You don't have to enter in a code or anything. Just go to the website. It's there. And also, if you receive this email from the AME Church, the AME Zion Church, you have access to a special study guide. We will talk more about that again at the end. But once you hear the discussion, we are almost sure you'll want to buy this book. And not only buy this book, but share this book with your church. So without further ado, thank you, gentlemen, for being here with us. And we now will have our discussion on the book White Too Long.
Thank you, John. I want to begin by saying how excited I am that we have this opportunity again, Joel. I mean, most people do not realize that inside of Orlando, Joel Hunter and I have been on a number of panels and discussions that's discussed race and racial relations. I mean, there have been times in which we have found ourselves asking each other some hard questions. And the questions have always been received because we have a genuine appreciation and value and love for each other. And when I had the chance, through the unctioning and the recommendation of a brother by the name of Randolph Bracey, Sr., who told me about the book, and I went and read the book entirely from cover to cover, and immediately got on the phone and called Joel and said, Joel, have you read this book? And Joel immediately responded to me in a manner that says, yes, Terence, let's do a panel discussion. Immediately, without doubt and without question, he jumped on it. And we were blessed to have Dr. Jones to come to sit with us as we had a wonderful discussion. With that being said, I want my friend Joel to begin this conversation with Dr. Jones, and we're going to find ourselves talking with each other similar to the way we did then, and I pray you're going to be blessed by the discussion. Joel?
Well, thank you, brother. It's first of all, thank you to our hosts for this program. I'm an old Methodist myself. Spent a lot of time in Cokesbury shopping for clerical robes back in the day, and so this is kind of like coming home. But I also back in the day was a part of the civil rights movement, and have been a part of that movement for the last 50 some years. And so when I read Dr. Jones's book, White Too Long, it was not just a cold, clinical, historic, data-driven account. It was deeply personal, and it's written deeply personally. It engages your heart as well as informing your mind. And I think that's what's important, especially for the white folks that are trying to figure out, how complicit have I been? What do I need in the way of information so that I can empathize and be a part of the solution, and run me back into what I didn't learn because it wasn't taught in our schools. And so that's what's been valuable to me and many others. So let me ask Dr. Jones if he would just give us a thumbnail sketch of the book so that those who have not read it can be engaged. And then maybe the pastor and I, Pastor Gray and I, could ask some questions and engage him, because he is, I got to tell you, one of the premier experts on this topic in the United States. And so Robbie's an old friend of mine. I can call him that. Can you give us a thumbnail sketch of the book?
Yeah, well, thanks. Well, thanks, Reverend Gray and Reverend Dr. Hunter. I'm so honored, really, to be a part of this conversation. So thank you for having me. Thanks to two denominations coming together. It's amazing. But I'll tell you just a little bit, about the book. It is a deeply personal book, and I guess to start at the beginning. So you have to know from whence I come, who my people are. So I grew up as a Southern Baptist in Jackson, Mississippi, for the most part, with family roots that go back into Middle Georgia, 6 generations, in and around Macon, Georgia, Bibb County, and Twiggs County, Georgia. And really, this book was the book I had to write for myself, to really try to reckon with my own denomination, my own faith, and the relationship and entanglement with white supremacy that has kind of run through our history. But as Joel said, a history that I was never really taught. And I think that's one of the more stunning things too. I grew up in the church. I was that kid who was at church literally 5 times a week. I was active in the youth group, Sunday school, the Baptist training union, choir, the whole 9 yards youth group and everything. And yet I never heard anything at all about our own denomination's history. For just one quick example, it's where I actually start the book is it wasn't until I was 20 and in the Baptist history class in seminary that I heard anything about what the word Southern means in Southern Baptist Convention, and that it wasn't just a geographic designation, but it's there because it was a place marker for justification for slavery, that it was the churches in the South that separated from the churches in the North, really pre-Civil War, 1845. And since we mentioned the Methodist here, the broader Methodist family, white Methodists split in that same year, 1845, over the issue of slavery. We get the Methodist Episcopal Church South and North, and we get the Southern Baptist Convention branching off as well, but all around providing a Christian blessing on enslaving other people based on the color of their skin. And so that is the genesis story of my denomination. And as many of you know, Southern Baptists, were no fringe denomination. And by the middle of the 20th century, our denomination had grown to be the largest. It surpassed Methodist and become the largest Protestant denomination of any kind in the country. And so it really became literally the face of white Christianity in the country, with this kind of legacy that had been suppressed and kind of pushed down and really hidden even from its own members, is my own kind of experience to test. So the book is really kind of stands on three-legged stool. It's part memoir. The first sentence of the book has the word I in it. The last sentence of the book has the word us in it. So I am writing from a deeply personal place, but then has a lot of history in it. I did more history in this book than I've done in any other book. And then it also has some data in it. My day job at PRRI, that's the Public Religion Research Institute. I'm and I'm trained as a social scientist, and so a part of the book too doesn't just look at the history and where we've come from, but it looks at current public opinion data and shows us, hopefully a really troubling but important mirror, holds up a mirror to us about where we are today. And how this legacy that's so deep in the DNA of white Christian churches, of white supremacy, is still very much a part of us today.
I want to jump in there, Robert, if I can, and because as you talk about the data, if you would just bring us up to date as the persons who are sharing with us. You did a major study regarding to be Christian and to be racist. You did a wonderful job with that. Can you talk a little bit about that and should bring everybody up to par?
Sure. So as I mentioned, so my training is a social scientist. I should give out another shout out to Methodist. I was trained at Emory University in their graduate division of religion, so good Methodist school there. And but what I wanted to do is to get a look at not just the history, but where things were currently. So one of the best tools to do that is public opinion data. So I tapped some data that we at Public Religion Research Institute had put in the field. And what I did is I tried to ask a series of questions and a large number of questions, particularly around people's perceptions around systemic racism. So and the current influence of past discrimination on the present. So I asked about basically that, like how much influence does past discrimination and the legacy of slavery still have in the country today? Also asked about very current things like the killing of African Americans by police. Is this part of a pattern or are these just isolated incidents? Asked about Confederate monuments and flags. Are these just merely signs of Southern pride or are they symbols of racism in the country? And about the criminal justice system in addition to policing. Anyway, a whole range of questions that were designed to really get at people's perceptions or ability to see systemic racism in the country. I dubbed it the Racism Index in the book, and it consisted of, at the end of the day, 15 different questions there across those areas that I just described. And when I combined them all into one index and I kind of standardized the scores on a scale of 0 to 10, it was really striking what I found. And so I looked basically at the three major families within white Christianity, and those are white evangelical Protestants. That's the group that's kind of more tends to be more conservative, more in the South. White mainline Protestants, these are non-evangelical or people who don't say they're evangelical or born again, tend to be kind of upper Midwest and Northeast. This is the National Council of Churches crowd, Episcopalians, Presbyterians, and the like. United Methodists are in that category. And then white Catholics, non-Protestants also. And looking at those three groups and comparing them to whites who are religiously unaffiliated, because what I really wanted to see is what work does Christianity do among white Americans with regard to racism. And what I was astonished, really what I found is that on that scale of 0 to 10, where 0 is holding least racist attitudes, 10 is holding the most racist attitudes, white evangelicals scored 8 out of 10 on this racism index. That may be not so surprising given their history in support of the Confederacy, support of segregation, and this kind of location in the southeast of the country. But what was maybe more surprising is that white mainline Protestants scored 7 out of 10, and white Catholics, who have their own history of being discriminated against in this country, also scored 7 out of 10. So you basically got all the kind of white Christian group between 7 and 8 out of 10 on the scale. And then when I looked at whites who were religiously unaffiliated, they only scored 4 out of 10 on this scale. And so essentially what this means is, statistically speaking, is if you take the average white American and you add Christian identity of any kind, Protestant, Catholic, evangelical, mainline, if you add Christian identity, it tends to move them up the racism index toward holding more racist attitudes than less.
Dr. Jones, that's a very discouraging observation and fact for those of us who are white evangelicals, especially. Could you speak a little bit about why that is? I mean, the institutional reinforcement of racism, or is it just that people are more slow to change if they belong to a particular institution than if they're more independent and more independent thinking? I mean, why do you think that is?
Yeah, well, I'll give you one more piece just to sharpen the point here. We also found because, one objection to that data might be, well, maybe those are people who just claim to be Christian, right? This is self-reported identity, but maybe it's not. Maybe they don't go to church, and so maybe it's not really people who go to church. They just identify as Christian. So I actually took a closer look at this and looked at the effect of church attendance on these attitudes. And I essentially found, as a whole, among white Christians as a whole, Christian frequency of church attendance made essentially no difference. That is, these effects of kind of white Christian identity moving one up the scale, holding more racist attitudes, held true among less frequent and more frequent attenders. However, when I looked inside of the world that I grew up in, the white evangelical world, I found something a little bit different and actually even more disturbing, which leads me to answering that question. And that is that inside the white evangelical world, turns out church attendance does make a difference, but it makes a difference in the opposite way that one might think or hope. And that is that the relationship between white evangelical identity and holding more racist attitudes is actually stronger among those who attend more frequently than it is among those who attend less frequently. Now, that does lead to exactly that question, Joel, like, why? Why is that? And I think it's actually fairly straightforward, and it only is a puzzle because we don't know the truth about our history. And so, when you really look at the history, and so, for example, when we say the words civil rights and church, right? You mentioned you're active in the civil rights movement. What most people think about are African-American churches that were hubs of organizing, sources of strength in resisting oppression, during the civil rights movement and really through all of our nation's history. But what many people don't think about are the role that white churches played, not just in being kind of on the sidelines, but in actively resisting movements for Black equality in this country. One little story that I think broke my heart from my own hometown in Jackson, Mississippi. So I should say, one, I did not know the name Medgar Evers until I was well beyond college, despite the fact that his driveway, where he was shot down, in front of his family, is 11 miles from my driveway, where I grew up in Jackson, Mississippi. It's just across town. I never heard, his name. I didn't know his story. And when I really started digging into it, this will kind of just peel back the onion, right? That the last thing that he was involved doing before he was assassinated was actually trying to integrate white Christian churches in Jackson, Mississippi. Galloway Memorial Methodist Church and First Baptist Church in downtown Jackson. One was the church of the mayor, one, and the other was the church of the governor, Ross Barnett, one of the most segregationist governors, in the 20th century. And he was running a campaign to help desegregate those churches when he was gunned down. And who was he gunned down by? He was gunned down by Byron D. LeBeckwith, right? Well, who is he? He's not just a white supremacist. He was a member in good standing in an Episcopalian church in Greenwood, Mississippi, who had been writing letters to the editor in the Delta papers saying that if any African American tried to show up at his white church, he would be standing on the steps with a pistol. He was on record doing that. So like we forget that part of our history, right? That this was this resistance was not just a sort of like passive thing that white Christian churches did, but white Christian leaders, white Christian churches were bastions of upholding this view of white supremacy well into the 20th century.
Now, Robert, I think that part of push back a little bit further in that with that question that Joel is asking, I think that even came up on the screen, the why part. Inside of your book, you take the time to talk about, I think it's the Southern Seminary. I think that's the name of it. And I might be wrong, you can correct me. But it's a seminary where a number of persons from the Southern Baptist Church go to learn and to be trained. Ultimately, the presidents that you shared in that book and the writings that they did, the connection they had with the Confederacy, even from the standpoint that they wrote a number of the principles that were done for the Confederacy back in the day. I think that even the president of the school, one of them was there to do the inaugural prayer for for Robert E. Lee. All that was a part of your book. So coming back to that, I want to push back as we keep asking, well, how did this happen? How can you be a Christian? How can you be a Christian and be racist? And I want to come back to say it's the slant. I want to ask you to push back on that slant for how the seminary was formed and how that seminary began nurturing the persons who would go out to pastor.
Yeah, well, this is all wrapped up with the story of the beginning of the Southern Baptist Convention. So with this break with Northern Baptists over the issue of slavery, if you're going to hold a denomination together and build a denomination around the idea that enslaving other human beings is perfectly compatible with the gospel of Jesus Christ, you're going to need to train ministers to that effect. And so there was a need to build a seminary that would train Southern white ministers with Southern slaveholding sensibilities. And this is essentially this. So the Southern Baptist Seminary, which is in Louisville, Kentucky today, that's its history. And its first president of the seminary, president of the board of the seminary, is a guy named Basil Manley Sr., who was one of the best known orators and preachers, leading up to and during the Civil War, justifying this worldview from a Christian standpoint. And he is deeply enmeshed. He was sort of known as the chaplain of the Confederacy. So he's the first president of the seminary. He's the architect of this break between Northern and Southern Baptists over slavery, and he is the person, in fact, who holds the Bible for Jefferson Davis to take the oath of office in Montgomery, Alabama, when he became the president of the Confederacy, and prayed an invocation at that event that calls down God's blessings on the Confederacy and talks about it as God's ideal for human society. I mean, this is overtly, what was preached and what was believed there. And so, it's so, I mean, this history was all new to me, right? It was not something I was ever taught. And I think recovering this truer history, I think, is part of us understanding how we got to, this place where we are, and I think the key to how we might get out of it, it's going to require a lot of deconstructing, a lot of reconstructing, and by white Christian churches that have inherited this really without much critique. We're still singing many of the 19th century hymns. We're still preaching. I've gotten an email from people that some seminaries are still using preaching manuals, and training ministers today that were from those founders of these seminaries that thought enslaving other people had no conflict with the gospel.
Let's stay just let me piggyback on that, because you kind of brought us up to the present day, and what we're seeing right now is a pretty violent in some cases, but at least a vehement reaction in most cases to learning about our history. The reaction to critical race theory, for example, the the bemoaning of the removal of the statue of Robert E. Lee, saying that you're trying to erase history and distort history and hide great men in history and so on and so forth. You probably have a better survey of what's going on nationally, not just because of your research, but because of all of the relationships you've developed through this book and your other endeavors. Is there any hope? I mean, is there any? I'm pretty discouraged right now, I got to tell you. I just there's such a disconnect between the gospel and the institutional reaction in the institutional church right now. What are you seeing? I mean, can you? I'm not asking you to just give me hope, but I am asking you to give me hope. You seen any hope?
Yeah, no, fair enough. So this may surprise you, Joel, and I can't remember whether I said this when we talked last, but I'm actually more hopeful today than I was when I closed the manuscript for this book at the end of 2019. Right, so I finished the manuscript, sent it off to the publisher at the end of 2019. That was before 2020, and any of the it was before the killing of George Floyd, the Black Lives Matter protests that erupted across the nation, really across the world in 2020. And so I give you just like one concrete way that I see some hope. So let's go to the former capital of the Confederacy, Richmond, Virginia. Just right down the road from me. I'm outside of DC. So I spent some time there doing research for the book. In fact, spent some time in the basement of the United Daughters of the Confederacy there. I'm digging through their archives, digging up stories like the one I just told. And one of the things that was striking when I was there is that all of those monuments to the Confederacy were there in Richmond when I was there in 2019. And for those of you who haven't been in Richmond, the largest of them are down this kind of westward heading, massive divided avenue called Monument Avenue, and punctuated out just about every sort of quarter mile or so are these big traffic circles. And inside these big traffic circles that are more than 100 feet across are these massive statues to the Confederacy, honoring Robert E. Lee, Jefferson Davis, Stonewall Jackson, a kind of Confederate naval hero, et cetera, and J.E.B. Stuart, who's kind of a local Confederate general there. But these were the first one to Lee was put there in 1890. Davis followed there about I think it was 1904, and then kept building them out. And then wildly, about seven that I could document of Richmond's white elite churches uprooted themselves from downtown and rebuilt their buildings around these traffic circles so that they could be facing and be a part of this Confederate lost cause worldview out on Monument Avenue. So and all of that was standing exactly as it was for 130 years in 2019. I went back last month to just get a view because many of those monuments came down over the summer of 2020 as a result of the Black Lives Matter movement and protest. The one that was left was Robert E. Lee. It was just removed last week after it got hung up in the courts, but it was just removed as well. Maybe you may have seen that. So for the first time in 130 years, if you drive down, the citizens of Richmond, black and white, Latino and others, are not put on a forced pilgrimage to this lost cause of the Confederacy every time they want to just go down the street, and because it's one of the major thoroughfares in Richmond. And so that I see as progress. And one little caveat story I'll tell you here too, that because I think it is worth noting, is that First Baptist Church was one of those churches that moved itself out there in the 1920s to be near these Confederate monuments. And as the monument for Stonewall Jackson was coming down in 2020, that church rang its bell in affirmation of that statue coming down. And that bell has actually real significance. It was a bell that church had had before the Civil War, and they were so on board with the Confederacy that they actually the church offered the bell to the Confederate Army to melt it down and create cannon, right, to kill people for the right to enslave other people. That's how committed this church was. And yet in 2020, it turns out that they didn't take the Confederate Army, didn't take the bell, so they still had the bell with them. But in 2020, that same bell that was committed to kill and maim, to defend enslaving other people, was rung in 2020 to celebrate the removal of this white supremacist Christian, I should say, right? Stonewall Jackson, Robert E. Lee, Jefferson Davis, all Christian men, white Christian men, but to celebrate their removal in 2020. And just the arc of that bell, I know it's a symbol, doesn't solve everything, but it does mean something is different is happening in the world. And I can certainly say I'm 53 and younger than you, but I'm not that young. But I can say that, like, I have never seen anything like this kind of awakening that I'm seeing among white Christian churches. Again, it's not as big as we would like. It's not as big as we need it to be. But I think there is something stirring, finally, way too late and all of that. But I think there is something genuinely stirring over these last 3, 4, 5 years that does give me some hope.
Robert, I want to come back and ask you to kind of put some teeth to this, basically, because again, as we're removing symbols, there is also this issue of the heart, the internal, what is happening with the individual internally. And I raise that because I want to lead into the conversation of policies that are now being created for people who are policing and who are given the right to serve, as well as what we saw take place in DC when they raided Washington. That which is amazing, that basically caused my heart to grieve and also gave confirmation to what you wrote, is people were inside of the nation's capital and they were praying while they were really acting up and not really finding themselves being what I consider to be righteous. The internal focus, the inward person, I want to ask you, how then can we who make up the African Methodist Episcopal Church and African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church, how can we begin partnering with additional widespread conversations to detract or attack or to penetrate the hearts of individuals? Because no matter how many policies we write for people to appreciate my life and the life of my brothers and sisters who look like me, what I'm continuing to say is, if there's no inward change, then no matter how many policies you write, they're going to run back to their ethical core values. How can we help to change the core values?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, it's exactly right. I mean, I'm talking about symbols, but what we have to remember is that symbols are erected to represent values, as you said. And so the values that white Christian churches had, even well into the 20th century, erecting these monuments that were still being put up in the 1950s, as late as the 1950s and 60s. That's a deep theological problem within white Christian churches, and the public opinion data that I showed shows just how deep it is. And back to Joel's question about institutions, I mean, it is in fact that these have been passed down through the institutions, right? So theology, ritual, liturgy, hymns, images. So I wrote just a few weeks ago about images of white Jesus, in Christian churches, whether on stained glass or up in portraits hanging on the wall. That these are ways that white supremacy gets passed down from generation to generation. If we make the Savior white, we are saying something about. Well, first of all, it's like biblically inaccurate for those who care about that. But it is also meant that it is communicating this sense that a kind of racialized, Savior, and claiming that that image is the only image that you can see of Jesus, and it absolutely funds our theology. One of the kind of more disturbing things I came across in the research was Dylan Roof, who, of course, was the person who it was back in the news just a few weeks ago, appealing his sentencing was denied. But the young man who murdered people who were at Bible study in Mother Emanuel AME Church, right? But he also was a Lutheran, a person who went to church, grew up in the church, and what was disturbing is that in his journals he had in prison, he actually drew Christian imagery. So he wrote this kind of racist screed, in a narrative, but around all of it were sketches of crosses, sketches of, and the one I actually reproduced one in the book, a full page sketch of a white Jesus emerging from the tomb, right, where he's calling on Christians to not be timid, but to be a warrior's religion, right? He's doing this in the aftermath of this slaughter of innocent people, and that he had no problem connecting up his Christian faith, with that, and there's no doubt in my mind that his image of white Jesus, helped fund that view. If he had grown up in a church with a brown-skinned Jesus, hanging on the wall or up in the stained glass, I think that would have done very different work in him in terms of his theology. So I think it's theology, it's hymns. I remember singing hymns, that uses whiteness for purity and closest to God. Wash me and I will be whiter than snow. Yes, whiter than snow. Wash me and I will be whiter than snow. Like those hymns, we sang that hymn all the time in my Southern Baptist church, growing up. But I think thinking about these things, and it really does, I think, require a couple of things. One is to kind of get more concrete. One is I think it requires a kind of truth telling that we've never really been willing to do. In fact, we've done the opposite. We've lied, we've obscured. And I think it requires a kind of truth telling and honesty among white Christian churches that we have not really found the will to fully do. I think that process is starting to some extent. And in the wake of that, it requires relationships. I think so why some of the work that you and Dr. Hunter are doing in Central Florida is so important. I think there's work for white churches to do on their own, and a lot of that work to do on their own. And part of that is telling the truth about themselves and taking a hard look in the mirror. But one of the biggest barriers is that for many white Christians in the country today, they don't know a single person of color. And so in a world where everyone looks like you and there's the only people you talk to, the only people you know, it's hard to work yourself out of that worldview. And so I think the pull of relationships, the pull of being in community, is vitally important. Because I think otherwise the sort of moral vision of most white Christians has been so stunted and so obscured by this commitment to white supremacy that it really is hard to see.
As we go forward into the future, Robert, I think, first of all, you've really hit upon something that is key, and that is we talk a lot about identity, and for Christians, our identity ought to be in Jesus Christ, not in our race, not in our economic values and what part of the country we come from, but because of the tribalism that's going on right now, we tend to place our identity in other people who look like us and think like us and have our background and so on and so forth. So as we try to break out of those bubbles, do you see anything that is helpful to those who really do? I mean, I really have great relationships with people on the basis of our differences because it's so much fun to learn from them and be with them and get a perspective that's different than what we grew up with and so on and so forth. Are there any strategies, that's probably not a good word, that you might have for those who are in spiritual leadership? And every follower of Jesus is in spiritual leadership to somebody. So are there any strategies that would help us get someone else or influence someone to look higher for their identity and just the likeness of either their skin or their thought process.
Yeah. Well, in the book, I highlight a couple of case studies. I don't think there's any silver bullet here or kind of magic formula, really, but I do think I've seen some things that are working. One thing that has, I think, taken some pastoral leadership has been I've seen some partnerships form between a predominantly white church and a predominantly African American church, and I should just say this is requiring, and I think white Christians really need to be aware of what this requires of an African American church to be willing to even enter into such a relationship with a white church, given this history. I mean, it's an extraordinary act of generosity and patience when this is even available. But I think that white Christians really need to approach these things in that spirit of realizing how much distrust has been built by the actions and inactions of white Christians. But I think that partnering. I talked about these two churches in Macon, Georgia. Actually, both go by First Baptist Church, one predominantly white, one predominantly black, and it was really just a commitment to try to go on a journey together. And it wasn't anything fancy. It was really like we need to, or these two churches are actually in close proximity to each other. They actually historically used to be the same church. They split right after the Civil War. They just said, look, we're here. We're in the same part of the city. We need to be in conversation and community with one another. Let's figure it out. And they basically just came to a commitment of how to do it or to do it, and then started figuring it out. And it wasn't really even, it was food, fellowship, Easter egg rolls for the kids, youth group trips. It really wasn't pulpit swaps and Bible studies. I mean, it was really about food and fellowship. That began to build trust, and over time was able to move. But this is going to be, to do this well. I mean, it's challenging, I think, for predominantly white churches because it requires a relinquishment of control, it requires humility, and it requires a painful honesty and willingness to kind of look at oneself in ways that are deeply, deeply uncomfortable in order to come to a place of community. But the rewards, as you mentioned, Joel, are really high. And I think this is one of the things I want to make sure I kind of get out here is that white Christians often have thought about this as some kind of altruistic thing, right? And there's no doubt that in this process that repairing the damage to those who we've harmed is such an important part of what we're required to do as part of our faith. But I think white Christians forget that it's not just other people who have been harmed by us allowing white supremacy to live among us, that we have harmed ourselves, right? We have warped our ability to see ourselves for who we are. We've warped our ability to be in right relationship with others. We've disfigured our faith, right? And so there's a way in which we're really about accomplishing not only repairing the external damage, but repairing the damage we've done to ourselves, and being willing to kind of hand some and about being about the project of handing something down that's healthier to our children and grandchildren. I think that, and as you mentioned, Joel, I mean, there's a way in which engaging it can actually be quite life-giving, right? And kind of freeing oneself from the confines of this thing that we've inherited, that I think, if we're all honest with ourselves, we know in some ways is deeply, deeply flawed. But I think this kind of, again, this idea of relationship and kind of boiling it down, right, to being willing to tell the truth, no matter what that is, and being willing to love all of our neighbors, and no matter how uncomfortable that is.
Right before we find ourselves transitioning, I appreciate you moving to the conversation that I think that we wanted to really almost talk about, where do we go from here, which we share the Macon experience. So I do know about both those first Baptist churches in Macon, Georgia, which was always interesting to experience and to see. I want you to go ahead and talk about, just before we go, because if you don't buy the book for no other reason, this is one of those that I think was phenomenal. Dr. Jones, you came to the end of the book, near the end of the book, and you make a phenomenal declaration that while biblically inside of the Southern theological seminaries, that they described the mark of Cain and the curse of Ham in a negative and pointed towards black people or blackness. But strangely enough, you make the statement that the real mark of Cain is whiteness, because it's white people that have killed their brothers. Can you expound upon that? Because I think for the people who make up this audience today, if there's for no other reason that they need to go grab a book to have something in hand to basically look at and to review, but go a little bit in depth to share with us how you arrived at that and what unctioning pushed you there.
Well, I appreciate that. It's probably the most, sermon-like element in the book, I guess. I kind of dust off my MDiv a little bit there at the back of the book. But, I was actually moved to that connection from a visit to the Equal Justice Initiative's museum, the National Memorial for Justice and Healing down in Montgomery, that commemorates the history of lynching in this country. And they have this display in the museum that has soil samples from sites of lynching all over the country. And so there are these clear glass jars, and there are row upon row upon row upon row with all different kinds of soil, dark and red clay of southern Georgia, and dark of the black soil of the Delta. And it is stirring. And what came to me is this image from Genesis, or chapter 4, the story of Cain and Abel. And there's this line in there, where God says, your blood cries out from the ground. And Cain is denying, right, any responsibility. But the two words from God to Cain are these kind of rhetorical questions, right? God, of course, knows what's going on in the text, that Cain has killed his brother, Abel. But the two questions that God asked Cain are, where is your brother, and what have you done? And he's giving Cain an opportunity really to come clean and to confess. And what's ironic is that story has so often been used by white Christian, in the hands of white Christian theologians and preachers. This kind of the mark of Cain was like seen to be where it was interpreted to be where all brown-skinned people came from. And of course, that interpretation puts the origin of brown-skinned people in the hands of the kind of ancestor of all brown-skinned people to be a murderer, right? And so this was clearly part of the intention, was to kind of give a different lineage, one connected with criminality, to brown-skinned people, and trace white-skinned people back to Adam, into our nobler lineage. But I actually think that the flip side of this is that a better interpretation for us today is to really think about this. Yeah, exactly as you said. Like, if we're asking, like, and standing there in Montgomery and looking, for those of you who've been there, when you're looking out at these kind of cubes hanging from the ceiling, and there's one from every county in the country, and I realized that I moved around a fair amount, from Missouri to Mississippi, Georgia, here in DC, and realizing, for example, that there's only been one small county I've ever lived in my life that was free of a history of lynching. Right, that this is so deep within our country's DNA and consciousness, and this sense, if you have, well, where are you? What have you done with your brother? Where's your brother? That we white Christians, I think, still have not honestly answered that question to God. And so I bring it back to that text and say, it's actually the flip side of this story is a better understanding of the condition of white Christians today, that it really is us that has to answer this question that still hangs out there from God. And that is, where is your brother, and what have you done?
And the sticking point for a lot of white Christians, Robert, is that we associate confession with shame instead of freedom.
Yeah.
And we just don't want to go to shame, but we need to remember that if we confess our sins, he is faithful and just to forgive our sins and cleanse us from all unrighteousness. And so what your book is about the possibility of freedom, recognizing the truth, the hurt, regret, but shaking off the shame by confession. And so it's really important for those of us, again, who know the freedom of confession and repentance to talk about that.
Yeah, thanks, Joel. I think there's a real way in which I wrote this book to try to disentangle as best I could myself and my own faith from white supremacy. And it was a journey of freedom. And there were certainly some moments where I had to kind of push away from the keyboard and take a walk and wipe the tears from my eyes when I really realized what the words on the page were saying and that they were true. But I think this is exactly right, that we've been entangled in this far too long. And if we want to place, I'll quote Baldwin here, on the way out. And that's, by the way, White Too Long is a quote from James Baldwin, but I'll kind of quote him on the way out here because I think it captures so much of what I hope the book is about. And he said this nearly 50 years ago. If we can muster the humility and courage and love to tell the truth, we just might end the racial nightmare and achieve our country and change the history of the world. And as dire as things are and look and seem, I'm still hopeful that possibility, is in front of us.
All right. Thank you very much. That was an amazing conversation. TCR Dialogue was a book, White Too Long. Was an informative and relevant roundtable discussion for such a time as this. And I would say, judging from the comments that I've been scrolling on my phone, trying to check up with, I think our viewers are in total agreement that the conversation was informative and relevant for this time. Also, judging from the comments, I will say this, that people are not surprised, and it's unfortunate that they're not surprised. They've seen, they've heard it, they've commented over and over again saying, wow, this is interesting, but not surprising at all. Not surprised that institutional racism is still a mindset of today. Not surprised that institutional reinforcement of racism is still prevalent, and not surprised that there was and still some cases an intentional effort being put forth to continue this thought pattern. But with God, we are hopeful that through conversations like this, that we will be able to put a spotlight on this, and the change that is needed to overcome will eventually happen. Listen, you're going to want to go and you want to get this book. It's available now at cokesbury.com. The book is available at a discount up until September 30th. Okay. Now, that does not mean wait until September 30th to get your book. You know how we act, Black people. All right. So we're going to ask that you please go now and get your book at cokesbury.com. And it also comes with a study guide, an electronic study guide as well. That's also available at your discretion. Get your book tonight. Make it happen now. And if you are interested in any more of Dr. Jones's research, please visit www.prri.org. Thank you so much to Dr. Hunter, Reverend Gray, and special thanks to you, Dr. Jones, for sharing with us on tonight. And to all of our viewers from the AME Church, the AME Zion Church, and all of Christendom, we ask that you please have a blessed night, enjoy your night, and tune in next time for TCR Dialogues. Have a great one.
It was made to save game nights and marquee lights. Tuesday Night Live, good vibes, and the Sunday Drive. It was made to save family meals, turkey naps, and taffeta. It was made to save 9-to-5s and just being able to provide. It was made to save the lifesavers. It was made by the best among us to be effective. The COVID-19 vaccines were made to save. They were made to save us.